You with me, Tatiana?
I'm thinking you have to be really exterior.
Yes.
Not only from your body, but from identity as well. To be unlimited in your development of abilities.
That's a very good way to say it. You have to be exterior. You can't be inside a box. You can't be enclosed in anything and be able to fully expand. That's a good way to say it. You have to be exterior. So we have to include in processing towards the ultimate abilities, again, towards infinity of spirit, then it becomes necessary to process identities. And John Galusha came up with what he called identics. In Scientology, sometimes we sort of process what they call valences in running Dianetics. We see the incident from the viewpoint of somebody who was more dominant in the incident, and we run this out. But actually, in doing that, we don't fully run out all the characteristics of the identity we call a valence. We don't fully run it out. That's an interesting discovery that I've come to realize. With John Galusha's system, identics, I have not made a study of identics. I cannot go into detail in describing how it works. But I can tell you that I have spoken with people who experienced identics, and mostly they thought it was remarkable. It was great processing. So I wouldn't discourage experiencing identics. But what I use and what I have found brilliantly effective is what Alan Walter developed and called Presence 3 Identity Handling. It's actually a rundown consisting of 16 steps. And part of what's fascinating about this is that it goes beyond the negative gain concept. You know, halfway through this, a person is no longer under the unconscious effective influence of the identity. They exteriorize from the identity. It is very interesting how this happens, but that is not the goal. That is only halfway through this rundown that he calls Identity 3. And you go through first describing the characteristics of the identity. You spot where that identity is. You know, where you have the person name the identity. You know, it can have a name like Joe. You know, it can have a name that's descriptive. You know, like office worker, or any million of things it could be. But anyway, then you ask the person, part of this is, I'm not going to go through the whole procedure with you, but where is that identity? I find, this is one thing I find fascinating. There are several things I find fascinating about Presence 3. Going in sequence of the rundown, one of them is, when I ask the person the question, where is that identity? Where is Joe? Or whatever descriptive name the person gives it. 19 out of 20 people perceive the identity as emanating from a specific point. Well, they all see it as emanating from a specific point. When I ask, where is that identity? We've run this, you and I. Okay, so you know what I'm talking about. It emanates from a certain physical point relative to where you are. But 19 out of 20 times is very interesting to me. I didn't read this anyway, I just observed this in session. It's here. The person describes it as being about 10 inches in front of their left eye. You know, 19 out of 20 times, that's where the identity resides. Why do we put it there? Or why do we wear it from that point? I haven't come across or even thought about why that is yet. You know, but it's just interesting. It's right there. That's where it is. And then we go into a full description of the identity. And at any point, the person could suddenly realize the effect of this identity, exteriorize from it, and then discover that they are no longer being that identity, under the influence of that identity. It's, in Scientology terms, we'd say it's blown. Sorry for the quotation marks, but you know what? We say it's blown, and in Scientology terms, we would be done with it, you know, but we're not done with it, because in all we did in wearing that identity, okay, we stuck ourselves with all kinds of fixed ideas and a whole track of behaving as that identity. We've committed harmful acts as that identity. We've dominated other people with that identity. We've come to view people a certain way with that identity, communicate a certain way. Many things, many what we call replications, okay, which are automatic, continuing projections of three-dimensional images relating to this identity of behavior and of attitude, and by simply getting to the point of, I'm free of that identity now. Okay, what that really means is that we are now in charge. You know, it doesn't mean that we still won't be stuck with some of the creations of that identity, but we're no longer actively creating that identity or having it create us, however you perceive it, okay? And those things still need to be dealt with. And beyond that, well, before we go any further, there's a key point in Presence 3, which is the most common point where people, quote-unquote, blow the identity, just become exterior from that identity. And it's the simplicity of it is wonderful. Basically, if you look at the book Scientology 8808, Ron describes beingness as simply being havingness of space. So personality or beingness or identity essentially is havingness of space. But it's not just how much space we inhabit, you know, but it's what we put in that space, what characteristics and qualities we inhabit that space with and emanate from that space. Havingness, beingness is havingness of space. But a most very important thing about that might be the volume of space that defines how big we are, okay? And when that identity is bigger than us, that's when we're stuck in dramatizing the identity. And there's very simple questions. How big is that identity? And the person will answer, okay, how big are you? Okay. How big is that identity? How big are you? I'm just taking a couple of the commands out. And what will happen is you get the action of as-isness. You get the deconstructing of the mechanics of this identity. And as you run through this process, inevitably, every single time what happens is the person sees the identity as getting smaller and themselves getting bigger, you know? And eventually they're much bigger than the identity. For some people, the identity just appears to have no space at all. Sometimes it's simply much, much smaller than the person. But that is the end result of that part of the process. And there's this sense of release. There's a sense of, oh, they feel very different. They're no longer feeling all the sensations and attitudes associated with the identity. That is where we say it's quote-unquote blown. But then, and this is also very interesting, see, an identity is a solution, it's a tool. And in this universe, okay, where we are known by what we create and how we present ourselves and the three-dimensional holographic images we impose on others of ourselves and the three-dimensional holographic images we impose on everybody of them. That's basically how we play the game of relationships. So then, once you process out, you know, being stuck in this identity, now that three-dimensional outfit, that costume, you know, you're out of it, and it's a very different feeling. And, of course, once this is done, then, you know, much more positive processing can occur where this identity limited it. That's how this relates to positive processing. But also, this identity itself had a value, it had a purpose. It was, at least one point in time, a solution to what was being encountered. Every piece of what we call negative case that we have, every piece of it, we took on as a solution to something. The solution could be boredom, you know, and so we'll get the buzz of some interesting somatics and sensations and pains, because anything is better than nothing. That's why we have a physical universe. We want to experience things. We want something to experience. It can get very aberrated, you can imagine. Anyway, as this relates to what I'm talking about, the next parts of processing this identity now come into focus. Just as sometimes in Scientology, when you're processing like a drug rundown, okay, well, it can be relevant to process what harmful acts the person committed while under the influence of drugs. Okay? Would work the same way with identities, wouldn't it? Because you're still going to feel a responsibility for what you have caused, whether it was done as something else or as an identity or because of the attitudes taken on along with having drugs. You know, a person still has the consequences of what they've created attached to them until they fully own it. So the same thing is true with identities. A person needs to process out their creations as that identity. Okay? And also goes with that now the positives of that identity. Like I said, it was a solution. It solved the problem at some point, and then it became an automatic replication that we were still wearing long after it fit the situation. Another thing that's true of all case that we have. So now part of this rundown is processing the positives of that identity. Because you know what? In the games of relationships, there very well may be times when being that identity is appropriate. It just can't be unconscious as an automaticity, because then it severely limits the person, and then you're not free to be you, and you're not free to process positives and fully realize your goals. So that's all part of the Presence 3 processing that Alan Walter came up with. I guess one of the other things I want to say about Presence 3, I'll say two things. One is that when you process out a painful incident, an engram, a moment of shock, I'm going to explain more about moments of shock, but anytime you process out a negative occurrence, as a processor, you can ask the person, is there some identity that you became as a solution or because of that incident? And something like 19 out of 20 times, you're going to get a yes from the person. And you have this wonderful opening to process out something as large as an identity that is much larger in effect than processing out a painful incident. I now regard processing out engrammic incidents as the tip of the iceberg and an opportunity to now help the person to process out something much larger, an identity. Another interesting point about actually running Presence 3 identity handling on everybody that I've run it on, every single person, and every time I've run it on the person, they will say something very much like this. They will say, I can't wait to see what my life is going to be like now, because they feel so different, so free of what they were being. I can't wait to see what my life is going to be like now. Now you've got a person who's really ready to access some goals and some positives, and they're excited about it. Okay.